My mother stood at the head of her own 70th birthday party in Des Moines, Iowa, cutting slices of cake for each of her 7 grandchildren. And when she reached my daughter Nora, she set the knife down, looked directly at her and said, "Only good grandchildren get treats, and you know what you did." My name is Anneliese Farrow, 37 years old, and my daughter Nora had just turned 7, standing there in a room full of cousins already eating their cake, holding an empty paper plate while my mother, Marguerite, moved on to serve the next grandchild in line as though she hadn't just publicly, deliberately excluded a 7-year-old from a birthday cake in front of the entire family. I want to be honest about the specific, controlled fury that moved through me in that exact moment, understanding immediately what my mother was referencing, even though I found the entire situation almost impossible to reconcile with any reasonable standard of proportionate response. 3 weeks earlier, during a family dinner at my mother's house, Nora had accidentally knocked over a glass of juice, staining the corner of an antique lace tablecloth that had belonged to my grandmother, an accident Nora had immediately, tearfully apologized for, an accident I had personally helped clean up while reassuring my mother, repeatedly, that we would cover the cost of professional cleaning or replacement if the stain didn't come out. I had genuinely believed, based on my mother's response at the time, a tight-lipped but seemingly accepting accidents happen, that the incident had been resolved. I had no idea, standing in that birthday party watching my daughter hold an empty plate, that my mother had apparently spent 3 weeks quietly deciding that a 7-year-old's accidental spill warranted a public, humiliating punishment delivered in front of her entire extended family. I crossed the room immediately, took Nora's hand, and told my mother as calmly as I could manage given the anger tightening in my chest, "We're going to talk about this privately, Mom. Right now." My mother followed me into her kitchen, still holding the cake knife, her expression carrying an unfamiliar rigidity I hadn't seen from her in years. "She needs to learn there are consequences," my mother said. "That tablecloth belonged to your grandmother. It's irreplaceable." I don't think it's unreasonable to expect a little more care and remorse than what I've seen from her since. "She's 7, Mom," I said. "She apologized immediately. She cried. We offered to pay for the damage. What exactly did you want from her beyond that?" My mother's composure, which had remained carefully intact through the initial confrontation, finally cracked in a way I found genuinely startling, given how rarely I'd witnessed my mother's emotional control slip during my entire adult life. "I don't know," she said, her voice suddenly considerably smaller. "I think I wanted her to understand that things have value, that carelessness has consequences. I think I've always believed that, ever since I was a little girl myself." I want to describe what happened over the following conversation carefully, because I think it matters considerably more than the birthday cake incident itself. My mother, sitting at her own kitchen counter, began telling me something about her own childhood I had genuinely never heard in 37 years of being her daughter. A childhood shaped by my grandmother's own rigid, conditional approach to affection and reward. A pattern I'd never fully understood the depth of, given how rarely my mother discussed her own upbringing in any detail. "My mother used to do the exact same thing," she told me, her voice carrying a rawness I found genuinely disorienting to witness. "Treats, privileges, even simple affection, all of it depended on whether she judged you'd earned it that particular day. I remember being denied dessert for weeks after I accidentally broke a china figurine when I was around Nora's age. I remember promising myself, as a teenager, that I would never make my own children feel that way. I sat with that revelation for a long moment, understanding, with a complicated mixture of compassion and continued frustration, that my mother had apparently spent decades believing she'd successfully broken a painful generational pattern, without ever fully recognizing that she'd simply been passing a version of it forward to her grandchildren instead of her own children. "Did you ever do this to me?" I asked, genuinely uncertain of the answer, searching my own childhood memories for evidence I hadn't previously recognized as part of a larger pattern. My mother was quiet for a long moment. "Not quite this specifically, I don't think. But I remember being stricter with you than I probably needed to be about things breaking, or messes, or anything that felt careless. I think I convinced myself that being strict about that specific thing was different from what my own mother did, because I still let you have dessert, still told you I loved you. I don't think I ever fully examined whether the underlying pattern was really so different after all. I want to be honest about how carefully I navigated the rest of that conversation, understanding that my mother was working through something considerably deeper and more painful than a simple disagreement about how to handle a spilled glass of juice. But I also understood that recognizing the origin of a harmful pattern doesn't automatically undo the harm it's currently causing, and I needed my mother to understand that distinction clearly before we could move toward any genuine resolution. I understand where this comes from now, I told her, and I have real compassion for what you went through as a kid, but Nora doesn't know any of that history, Mom. All she knows is that her grandmother publicly humiliated her at a birthday party over an accident she'd already apologized for and that we'd already agreed to fix. Whatever pattern you're working through, it can't keep landing on her. I want to tell you what happened over the following months, because I think it matters considerably more than the initial confrontation in that kitchen. My mother requested, somewhat hesitantly, whether I thought it might help for her to talk to a family therapist about the pattern she'd apparently been unconsciously carrying forward from her own childhood. A request that genuinely surprised me, given how rarely my mother had shown interest in that kind of reflective work throughout my entire life. She began seeing a therapist regularly, and over several months, in conversations she chose to share with me gradually, in pieces, began unpacking a considerably more complicated relationship with her own mother than I had ever previously understood. Not simply the conditional treats and privileges, but a broader pattern of love that had always felt provisional. Dependent on performance and carefulness rather than freely, unconditionally given. I want to describe the specific moment I think mattered most in this entire story, because I think it captures something considerably more meaningful than any single apology could have. Roughly 4 months after that birthday party, my mother asked if she could take Nora out for ice cream, just the two of them, an invitation I agreed to with some careful, watchful hope, rather than any full certainty about how it would unfold. Nora came home from that outing practically glowing, telling me that Grandma Marguerite had let her order whatever she wanted, even though I spilled a little bit of my water at the table. A detail Nora mentioned almost offhand, entirely unaware of how significant that small, deliberate moment actually was. My mother told me later, in a quiet phone call that evening, that she'd spilled water at the table herself, on purpose, specifically to watch how she'd respond to Nora's reaction, understanding that she needed to actually practice a different pattern in real time rather than simply intellectually understanding where the old one had come from. I wanted her to see me react differently, my mother said. I wanted to prove to myself, as much as to her, that I could actually do this differently, not just apologize for the birthday party and go right back to the same old pattern the next time something similar happened. I want to be honest that this story doesn't end with some simple, permanent transformation of my mother into an entirely different person. She still, occasionally, catches herself slipping toward old patterns of conditional approval, though I've noticed, over the 2 years since that birthday party, a genuine, consistent effort to notice those moments and correct course, considerably more consistently than I might have expected given how deeply entrenched the original pattern clearly was. Nora, now 9, has a considerably warmer relationship with her grandmother than she did in the months immediately following that birthday party, though I've made a deliberate choice to remain watchful, understanding that genuine change in deeply rooted family patterns tends to happen gradually, with real effort, rather than through any single dramatic conversation or apology. I think often about that specific phrase, "Only good grandchildren get treats," and how many generations of careful, conditional love that single sentence apparently carried forward, from my grandmother to my mother to, very nearly, my own daughter, before someone finally recognized the pattern clearly enough to actually name it and begin, however imperfectly, working to break it. I don't think every family pattern like this gets interrupted successfully. I think it required my mother's genuine willingness to look honestly at her own childhood, to sit with real discomfort about her own mother's parenting, and to actually do the ongoing work of practicing something different rather than simply apologizing once and hoping the pattern would quietly correct itself. Nora had cake at her grandmother's birthday party this year. Along with every other grandchild, no conditions attached, no accidents from previous weeks silently weighed against her. It's a small thing, on its surface, but I think about 3 generations of women in my family and how much quiet, generational weight that one small, unconditional slice of cake actually carried.